Chapter 4. Obie's first instinct was to run, but he hesitated when he saw Jason sobbing nearby, curled up in a ball on the ground. Easter was still in the field. Wilson grabbed Obie by the neck of his shirt. "Where you been?" he yelled again. "Went to check on a sow I thought was loose, sir," he said, avoiding Wilson's eyes. "You lyin'." The muscles in Wilson's thick neck stood out as if they would burst through his skin. Obie could have kicked himself for not guessing that Wilson wouldn't stay at the funeral. Still clutching him, Wilson drew back his free hand and snapped the strap across Obie's leg. Obie grabbed Wilson's shoulder, digging his fingers in the back of his neck. Jason, still sobbing, scrambled up from the ground. Stumbling frantically into the wheelbarrow, he sent it toppling over. Wilson ripped Obie's shirt down the front as Obie jerked away from him, trying to grab Wilson's upraised hand. Obie couldn't get a grip on him, and Wilson lashed the strap across Obie's cheek. Wilson drew his hand back to hit Obie again, but stopped short at the sound of horses' hooves in the yard. "Morning, sir," a voice said. Wilson loosened his grip. Obie, breathing heavily, backed away from Wilson and almost fell on top of Jason, who was still sprawled over the wheelbarrow. Jason sat up, his face wet and dirty. They stared at the two soldiers. Both soldiers wore the same gray tunics and soft forage caps. One of them had a smooth, boyish face. The other looked older and wore a thick black mustache. The one with the mustache dismounted. "I'm Captain Clark. How are y'all this morning?" he asked brightly. "Mornin'," Wilson mumbled. There was a bright red spot on his neck where Obie had grabbed him. He gave Obie a warning look. Jason wiped his eyes with the back of his hands, and Obie still trembled as he glared at the red blotch on Wilson's neck. "This is the Jennings farm?" the captain asked. "Yes," Wilson answered. He tried to fold his belt in his hand. The captain rubbed his mustache. "These some difficult times, sir," he said. "People round here been good about helping us." He glanced at Obie and Jason. "How many Negroes y'all have?" Wilson pointed to Obie. "He the only field hand. The other two is children, that runt and a gal." The captain rubbed his mustache again while the other soldier, still astride his horse, took notes in a small book. "Seems to be a sufficient farm," Captain Clark said. "It'll do," Wilson frowned. "Barely scratching a living out of it." "How many acres?" Wilson spread his stout legs as if he were balancing himself on a ship. 20. Who wants to know all this information?" "The government. Because of the war, everybody's had to help." "I hope y'all ain't looking for no man old as me to go marching off to war," Wilson said. The captain smiled slightly and rubbed his mustache again. "Well, sir, not exactly. People are aiding us whichever way they can, and that's why we ask questions. So we don't ask for what people can't give, sir. You have a wife and children?" Obie slowly grew calmer as he listened to Wilson answer the captain's questions. "We need soldiers, provisions, slaves, whatever can be spared." The captain stared at Obie. "We can't spare nothing," Wilson said loudly. Captain Clark walked toward Obie. "You don't mind, sir, if I take a look at him?" he said. "Suit yourself," Wilson answered, and put his belt around his waist. The captain put his hand on Obie's shoulder. "Open your mouth," he said curtly. Obie opened his mouth, and the captain checked his gums and teeth for signs of disease. He pulled up Obie's ripped shirt, inspecting his skin for open sores, then squeezed Obie's arms and legs. The inspection reminded Obie of the way John Jennings checked mules before he bought them. Captain Clark turned to the other soldier. "Clean, healthy, strong, prime. About 15 or 16, he said. The soldier wrote quickly. Wilson seemed ready to explode. He leaned into the captain's face. "He's the only field hand we got. How we going to get our crop in? How we going to live through the winter, Captain?" he shouted. The captain sighed, lowering his voice as Wilson spoke louder. "We're all fighting the same cause. People been donating their slaves. I ain't got 100 slaves. We ain't no rich slaveholders," he yelled. "We're fighting so you can keep what you have. We don't want you to lose none of this." He waved his hands towards the field. Wilson stared at Jason, whose round eyes were still fearful. "That one is useless. You take him," he said, pointing at Obie. "And we done for. We don't have no one else in this field." No sooner had the words left Wilson's mouth than Easter walked into the yard, leading the mule. "She's in the field," the captain said firmly. "She ain't no real hand. Not much better in the field than the runt." Easter looked at Obie. "Don't stand there with your mouth open," Wilson said to her. "Empty them sacks and get back to work." Captain Clark watched as Easter went into the barn, still leading the mule. "Sir, we're all making sacrifices. Some are giving their lives. We're only asking for one nigger to serve a year." He smiled sweetly at Wilson. "We have to build breastworks near Charleston. Takes a lot of manpower to put up those walls. He'd be going to Charleston, sir, but he's still your property." Obie's heart raced. He thought about Tyler, who was dead, and Jeremiah, who was probably dead also. He looked down at his bare feet, not wanting anyone to guess his thoughts. It's time to run now." The captain mounted his horse. "We'll return in 3 weeks, sir. Give you time to get your cropping done." Obie kept his face down. When they came back in 3 weeks, he'd be gone. "Guess we ain't got no say in the matter," Wilson said angrily, raising his voice. The captain ignored his comment. "What else you grow besides tobacco?" The other soldier pulled out his notebook again. "Tobacco's our big crop. Maybe you could also spare a hog or two, and a few bushels of corn, peas, whatever, for our sons? The boys are sacrificing their lives." He saluted Wilson. "3 weeks, sir." They rode out of the yard. Easter looked frightening. I left the barn. Obie clenched his fist, expecting Wilson to fly into a rage again. He knew he'd have to pay for what he'd done, but a part of him was glad that he'd tried to fight back. Wilson kept his belt around his waist. "Get back in that fields," he yelled at Easter. Then turning to Obie, he said stonily, "You let that gal work alone. You crop in Master Johnson's field." Jason gazed at Wilson in fear, as if he were expecting to be hit again. "You collect the firewood," he said to the small boy gruffly. Obie's head pounded as he, Wilson, and Easter walked back to the fields. Wilson swaggered a few feet ahead of them. Glancing at the cool, green oak grove, Obie felt as if he had the great iron shackles around his ankles again, like those he'd worn when they came off the boats in Charleston harbor. The sun burned directly overhead. Normally it would be about time for their midday meal. This usually consisted of whatever was left over from the previous evening's meal, and they'd eat right out in the field. But Obie knew now that Wilson wouldn't let them stop working long enough to drink a cup of water. Easter, walking close to him, held his hand. Obie knew she'd had a million questions to ask, but Wilson was close enough to hear anything they said. "I tell you later what happened," he whispered to her as they parted. "She and Wilson cropped in the same field, making sure she don't take a minute rest," Obie told himself. When he reached the farthest field, he sat down among the tall tobacco stalks, knowing that Wilson couldn't see him. He held his throbbing head for a few moments before beginning work. When he felt a little better, he worked steadily, leading his mule back and forth along the rows of wide green leaves.